Good morning. Welcome. My name is John Herbst, and I run the Eurasia Center here at the Atlantic Council. Today we have a wonderful event. Dr. Tatiana Mitrova, who runs the Energy Center at the Moscow School of Management, Skolkovo, will present a short paper on the Russian energy sector. And then we will have a panel moderated by Dr. Ariel Cohn to discuss her paper and the broader issues involved. This is the fourth of a 4-session lecture series that the Eurasia Center has been doing with the generous funding of the SCAFE Foundation. You can follow us on at AC Eurasia Russia Factor. And with that, I'd like to welcome to the stage Dr. Mitrova, whose bio you have.
Thank you so much, and thank you for the invitation for organizing this whole event. It's really my big pleasure and honor to be here. So I'll try to do my best to present the paper, which actually puzzled me a lot when I was approached by my colleagues from the Atlantic Council. So what can I say about Russian energy strategy? The problem is that I don't see it as a strategy, frankly speaking. So when we are looking at the whole situation in the Russian economy and Russian energy sector, which is a backbone of this economy, you feel that there are several very important choices to be made, and as long as there is no clear economic strategy, you can hardly talk about any energy strategy. So when you look at these main choices or crossroads, whether to go for more international cooperation or for further isolation, for private business and entrepreneurship development, or for increasing role of the state, for market-driven economy, or for more and more of administrative command system, you can see that the latter is prevailing. That's the current trend. But at the same time, when you look at the energy sector, you realize that if you want it to flourish and to develop, obviously you need to go for the first option with the technologies, with the ecosystem for international investments, and so on. So there is a very big contradiction between these fundamental choices, and there are different groups of influence inside Russian establishment which are actually trying to drive in the different directions. Therefore, I think the fate of the document, which is called Russian Energy Strategy up to 2035, which was submitted 2 years ago and is still somewhere in the government not approved, is a very good illustration of all these conflicts and contradictory interests. Different parties are trying to put inside this document different ideas, different goals, and as a result, it is absolutely impossible at the moment to find any consensus. And just to illustrate this whole mess, I think the example of internet blockade with the ban on Telegram, which has actually undermined work of many other internet services, is really in a very strong contradiction with all the calls for energy and economic digitalization. So how can you combine these two things? And it is applicable actually to any dimension of the energy sector development. Therefore, I argue that basically we cannot see a holistic, long-term strategic vision, but it doesn't mean that there are no tactical goals. And these tactical goals are clearly articulated in this document, Energy Strategy up to 2035. There are, oops, is it? No? May I ask to switch to the next slide, please? It doesn't work. Could you please help me? No, the previous. Yeah? Is it working? Yeah. here it is. So the official goals are here. First of all, to sustain Russia's position in the global energy market, market diversification with significantly higher share of Asia, energy availability and affordability for the domestic customers, strong reduction in energy intensity and emissions, and renewable energy development. So you see, they are not representing actually any coherent picture. And what I'm doing in my paper, I'm actually going through each of these priorities, trying to check how they are implemented in reality. And I would say that while the first two are really very important and they are really promoted with all the strength of the governmental machine, actually the three other are missing this attention, and they do not seem to be real priorities in this whole strategy. Why the first two are so critical? It's understandable very clearly from this graph. So hydrocarbons, they represent the biggest share in the federal budget revenues, and while in 2010, 2014 they were providing above 50% of total federal budget incomes, and now they've dropped down to 40%, and it is already quite painful, and it is stressing, and it is forcing the government to look for the solutions. And I would say that in this respect, all the efforts to find the way out, all the efforts to adapt. So you see the difference between strategy and tactical adaptation. Yeah. So all these efforts, they were extremely successful. OPEC Plus deal, which was unimaginable like 5-7 years ago, now it came true, and it is actually providing now the highest ever ruble price for oil and really high revenues from oil exports. Moreover, Russia managed to increase its oil production despite sanctions, despite this period of low oil prices, despite this increasing isolation. So of course there was drop in brownfield production, but at the same time new greenfields came on stream. And as a result, actually, even despite this whole very unfavorable environment, and even, surprise, surprise, despite the OPEC Plus deal, Russian oil production is now on the historical heights, and Russian oil exports are increasing. Last year, 2017, Russian oil exports have increased by 1%. How that happens? Very simple. Though Russia is complying with the production quotas, domestic demand is in decline, both because of weak economic performance and because of modernization of refineries, which are now requiring less crude to produce the same amount of oil products, and therefore export is growing. So the government was very smart in solving this tactical problem and finding the way out how to sustain oil revenues. In the longer term, that might be a bigger problem. First of all, due to the deterioration of the reserve base, when new big green fields are actually all under development already. So the companies will have to go for more sophisticated deposits, and at the same time, all the problems with the financial and technological sanctions. So here you see our scenario on Russian oil output, and here we foresee a lot of efforts from the government to sustain oil production, to find the ways how to replace import technologies, to find the ways how to incentivize, for example, enhanced oil recovery through changing taxation mechanism. That's something we expect to happen post-2020, when the first signs of this decline in oil production will occur. With gas, similarly, it is another very big priority, and you see that actually, again, despite all the conflicts, all the discussion on Nord Stream 2 and other hot issues, actually Russian gas exports are increasing for several years in a row, and it's not only pipeline gas which is booming, but it's also absolutely new position in the global LNG market, which nobody expected, even Russian government itself. So Novatek's ambitions and a really strong effort on development of Yamal LNG was extremely successful, and moreover, they are now preparing a series of new projects. You see with the blue color, with a different graph, it is 4 different plants that Novatek is planning now in Yamal and Gedan Peninsula, which could theoretically, if they are delivered, make Russia similarly large LNG exporter as Qatar, for example, or Australia. And Novatek has proven that it can manage these projects. They've just obtained patent for their new liquefaction technology, which can be produced domestically and which is very simple, straightforward, and can function only in the Arctic conditions, but which allows to save 30 to 40% on liquefaction costs. So there is also this competitive advantage potentially. Of course, we will see how it works in reality, but the plans are really very ambitious. And that is something that could help Russia to restore again its influence in the global energy market with special focus on Asia. So again, the first 2 priorities are under development, and that works pretty well. But when we go to energy availability and affordability for the domestic customers, the situation is not that rosy. So the prices are frozen, and in these domestic prices for gas, for electricity are basically frozen in the line with the inflation. So for the consumers, it doesn't seem to be like a big pain, but at the same time, the technological development of this sector and market mechanisms, they are also frozen, with huge monopolies dominating in the market, with the oil market moving from 4% Rosneft presence in 2002 up to nearly 50%, with a gas market being dominated by oligopoly of Gazprom, Novatek, and Rosneft without any hopes for real market liberalization, with electricity market where only 20% of electricity is sold under real market pricing, and the rest has different ways of state interventions and regulation and central planning, actually. So once again, as I said, it doesn't seem to be a strategy, it's much more tactics. So brilliant tactics, by the way, to solve current problems, but postponing solvement of the most important fundamental issues like structure of the industry, presence of the private capital, taxation issues, and so on. And renewables development and reduction in energy intensity and emissions, all these 3 issues are very closely related to decarbonization agenda, which is not actually relevant in Russia. So it's not supported neither by the government nor by the population. People do really worry about local pollution issues, but global warming seems to be something far away and not really important. And therefore, all the efforts on, for example, renewable deployment, they are driven only by the desire to have these technologies in Russia. So not to allow to lose this speed in the technological competition. Therefore, there was last year a series of auctions for wind power, slightly for solar power, like 5 gigawatt capacity, again under quite complicated state subsidization mechanism, which will be delivered by the companies, and that's it, mission completed. So it's not about changing the structure of the energy balance. It's not about energy transition. It's not about greener energy sector or anything like that. It's a very local, again, tactical solution which is proposed by the government. Not emissions issue is solved automatically by very weak economic performance. So even without any efforts, Russia will comply with all the requirements of Paris Agreement. Yeah. And energy intensity, though I would say energy efficiency and energy saving is one of the most popular slogans among all the ministries and regulators, and tons of different documents were adopted already. Actually, we do not see any progress at all. Moreover, in 2009 and in 2014-15, actually energy intensity has increased on the weaker GDP growth. And as long as the cost of capital has two-digit numbers, as long as private companies are really not willing to invest, and as long as the regulatory regime doesn't provide guarantees of investment return for energy efficiency investments, so for something which is not made by Gazprom, Rosneft, Rosseti, or any other big corporation, but which has to be provided by smaller players in the market, by the consumers, it doesn't fly. So as a result, we have a very strange animal which performs extremely well when it comes to the international agenda and presence on the global markets and its expansion and finding the ways how to adapt to this very sophisticated situation. And at the same time, absolute stagnation in the domestic market, both in terms of technological development, new market mechanisms, and in terms of demand. Demand is flat for gas, for electricity. It is just stagnant. It's not growing as the whole economy. So I'll stop on that, and I would be ready to answer your questions. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Atlantic Council. I'm Ariel Cohen, a senior fellow here. Today with us, two excellent panelists. Ambassador Richard Morningstar led the U.S. energy policy and energy security efforts and performed a number of other high-level policy tasks for a long period of time. I think, Dick, we first met, what, 25 years ago, something like that? Right. And ever since, Ambassador Morningstar was a shining star in our policy firmament. Elizabeth Rosenberg is Senior Fellow and Director of Energy, Economics and Security Program at Center of New American Security. She worked at Argus Media and was a senior advisor in the Obama administration and is an authority on sanctions, which is very relevant to what we're going to talk about. So I would suggest, Elizabeth, let's start with you. A couple of remarks, brief remarks, and then we'll go to Dick, and then you probably have some questions to ask our speaker.
Thank you, and thanks for the opportunity to be here. I read with great interest your paper. Congratulations on an excellent analytical piece. There are a number of analyses drawn out in there that I think are worth drawing out a little more, I hope in this forum, and spreading more broadly. I am particularly intrigued by one of your meta points in there about the sophistication and responsiveness of the Russian energy sector to cope with an array of exogenous factors here. Of course, we've mentioned the sanctions, the falling oil price, and using some sophisticated adaptation with currency and taxation in order to increase production and make this at a time when so few others globally were taking such a course with great effect for the Russian economy and for its export portfolio, and now as a even stronger competitor to the United States and other biggest producers of hydrocarbons. So I think I'll just briefly say one thing about sanctions to complement what you've said there, and then ask you a question, if I may, which maybe however you want to handle this, but you can hold the question until we make a couple more comments. But just to review a couple of things which some of you who've looked at Russian sanctions may be familiar with, but at the expense of drawing you through it, but to bring us to the same page, I just wanted to note that I agree with the assessment that the sanctions in 2014 had a serious impact on Russia, although somewhat less so than the effect of the price drop. And the so-called energy sanctions less so than the financial sanctions, which happened to affect energy companies. And therein is a really important point, which is that the vulnerability here is not so much about the supply and provision of energy, but rather the financing surrounding it. And in fact, I see that as the most significant risk going forward for the energy sector. And it's not necessarily a really direct threat at a particular company, but rather shaping of the financial environment that these companies exist in. Which is to say, if you all have seen the sanctions announced in April of this year, which included designating a number of entities for acting in the energy sector, although most people just saw that as them being oligarchs. But actually that was the authority under which they were designated, but as well as some of their financial holdings. And when you're talking about Deripaska and Rusal and targeting a major non-financial but economic sector, which is to say aluminum in this case, the market, I mean, there's billions wiped off the Russian stock exchange, market, and markets really didn't know how to price in the volatility and the risk here, which explains why valuations of these companies were all over the map, and currency as well. And it really scared securities traders and FX traders who were thinking about, who remain quite concerned, thinking about what this means about the ability for any Russian company, now we'll talk about the energy sector, but others as well, to access capital in other markets, or whether the targeting will go after more kinds of corporate debt, including in the energy sector, or sovereign debt, which would be a game changer. And in fact, actually, the energy sector is not the thing we should all worry about most if sanctions do go after sovereign debt. But if that's the case, I think it can both be true, as you and many other people, including some excellent analysis from the Atlantic Council. I read with interest Bud Coote's paper on this topic, but people have pointed out, yeah, there we go, that it's simultaneously true that these sanctions had a shaping effect for the Russian energy sector in 2014, not so much now directly, which is why some people say they didn't have an effect, they didn't work after that 2014 period. But simultaneously, I think you can argue now that there is a significant effect, but it's a broader systemic effect shaping the choices that a number of the major Russian energy companies can take, specifically with regard to who they can partner with, which foreign companies, and what kinds of activities they can engage in outside of Russia, and their access to sophisticated technology. So I'll stop there, but I will just say one question I'd like to ask you to draw out when we come back to it is the effort for creating indigenous technology sufficient to get at difficult brownfield assets in the 2025 period and beyond, as well as offshore platforms. You've mentioned that there's an effort to develop this, but in fact, the technology may not come to be fully available when Russian firms need it if they continue on this current trajectory. So you've given a couple of scenarios for what happens then, but could you just draw it out a little bit more and what you think it'll mean for a couple of the biggest specific companies?
Can you hold to that question? We will go to Ambassador Morningstar, and then I'll have a question as well.
Thank you, Ariel, and thank you, Tatiana. It's really wonderful to have here, and we need to do this more, to have a real expert from Moscow here to discuss these issues. And I'd like to drill down also on some of the things that Elizabeth brought up, particularly in the sanctions area. I certainly accept your proposition, and Bud's paper confirms this. We have copies of this, I think, outside.
Okay.
Bud Koot's paper on sanctions, that sanctions, at least to this point, really haven't had a huge effect, and that the Russian economy, or the Russian energy economy, has done just fine, thank you, in spite of those sanctions. In fact, Bud points out that in fact, there may be a silver lining in that it delayed some very expensive projects during a time of low oil prices. But further on sanctions, I'd ask basically two questions. How concerned are you and colleagues of yours in the energy sector in Russia with respect to the potentiality of further sanctions? For example, on the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. The language in the act last summer was actually quite palliative. It made Nord Stream 2 sanctions discretionary, said it had to be done in conjunction with allies and partners, or in coordination with allies and partners. But there does seem to be some shifting ground in this area, and that there's some question, depending on our own domestic politics, how the Mueller investigation turns out, midterm elections, what happens with respect to other geopolitical issues like Ukraine, Crimea, Syria, that those sanctions could become mandatory. I'm not sure it's likely, but certainly a possibility. So a question then as to where you see future, what concern you have on further sanctions. Another area that's vague and uncertain, and I don't have I'm a lawyer but don't have the legal expertise as to where this comes out, is given the naming of certain individuals, certain oligarchs like Mr. Miller, does that have any effect on companies dealing with Gazprom? I'm not sure what the answer is to that. Maybe you've considered that, and there certainly ought to be clarification from OPEC here as to what that would be. And then the third area, as you're well aware, Chancellor Merkel stood next to President Poroshenko and said that, well, you can't have Nord Stream 2 unless the situation with respect to Ukraine is clarified. So the issues with respect to that is, given what would appear to be a motivation behind Nord Stream and Turk Stream, which was to avoid Ukrainian transit, how receptive would Gazprom and the Russian government be to a deal with respect to Nord Stream, which provided, in this question, how sufficient is sufficient, that a significant amount of transit to continue through Ukraine, maybe beyond the 30 BCM that has been talked about. And given, right, wrong, or indifferent, the fear that Gazprom would not honor such a deal, making it enforceable either through settlement of the competition case, or even, I'm not sure I really want to, but I will anyway, throw this one out. If there's going to be further sanctions, make it contingent upon Russia complying, Gazprom complying with some kind of agreement. So that's a whole bunch of things, but those are some of the things at least I've been concerned about.
Elizabeth, you wanted to jump in with another question or comment?
I can speak to the issue about what it means to sanction Alexei Miller. It's about parallel to sanctioning Sechin and what it means. But if you want to respond to our questions, whenever you want.
I think there's plenty. This is a feast of questions on the table, and I'm going to jump in and ask you a question with regards to your paper. I think the paper is excellent. And the paper, to me, when I read it, lays out a case that Russia is doing fine in oil and gas. Thank you very much. The Novatek LNG project on time and on budget, as you said, with plans to expand it. If it was grandfathered with the sanctions and the sanctions didn't affect it, it's one thing. Going forward in the current sanction regime, and what Ambassador Morningstar alluded to, which the sanction regime is not set in stone, it can be expanded. That raises a whole new slew of questions vis-a-vis future expansion. But you also said that Russia is doing fine expanding sales to Asia, the eastern route. I actually heard President Putin announcing, discussing it with the group I was in Russia, probably 2005. This is how strategic these things are. And when you say there is no strategy and the document is not formally approved, I think the strategy is in Mr. Putin's head.
Absolutely.
And what else is on my list? You're talking about decline of less than 10% going forward in the overall oil production, but the question is how much of that oil is going to be exported and at what prices. You said it's the highest ruble sales. The other question is, and this is directly relevant, A, what is the dollar price is going to be going forward? And we're talking in a time horizon that you cannot really predict. 5 years, if anybody tells me that they can predict dollar prices of oil in 5 years out. Okay. And to what extent what we're looking at vis-a-vis Iran and possible Iran sanctions moving forward and instability in the Middle East is going to affect the prices. And guess what? This is in Russia's interest to keep this oil price. Today it was what? Brent is 75, give or take. Are we going to 80? Are we going to 85? If we're going to 80 and 85, then I'll ask you a question about the profitability of the Russian Arctic projects. Because I'm very pessimistic in the price environment of the last couple of years. You know, under 70 offshore Arctic, it doesn't make sense. But if you're looking 85 and north of 85 and into 100 maybe, then the Arctic offshore depends where. And onshore is cheaper than offshore, but that starts to make sense again. So I think you have enough questions to answer till the rest of the day, but let's try to do one round here and then maybe another round with the panelists, and then we'll go to the audience.
And if you remember all of the questions,
3 more questions
that have been asked, you truly are a genius.
Yes, she is.
Oh, I'll try my best, and you please help me if I'm missing something from your questions. So, with the sanctions, it is a pain. So though people in Russia, they split it into 2 camps. One camp is saying, okay, it doesn't matter, sanctions are just making us stronger, they are mobilizing us, and here is our agriculture recovering as the answer to sanctions, and we started to work on our own technologies and import replacement, thanks God, so very, very optimistic. The other camp says, oh my gosh, we've lost everything, we are going to crash, and so on. So I believe that the truth is somewhere in between as usual, and we made a special research at Skolkovo. It is available on our website in English, and it is called Life Under Sanctions, the Future of Russian Oil Production, where we made all the modeling field by field basis, trying to look how sanctions, current sanctions, could affect future Russian oil production performance. As you mentioned, absolutely correct. Right now, we do not see any impact on the operation of the oil and gas industry. There is definitely impact of the financial sanctions because companies which used to borrow money at 3 to 4% now have interest rate 13 to 14%,
Wow.
which is actually making them extremely cautious on the new investments. You need to have like 25% IRR in order to go for these loans. But anyway, state-controlled companies have access to the state financing, to the Russian domestic banking system. The others begin already to suffer, but still they had a very big safety cushion which they have accumulated during the years of high oil price. So it wasn't such an issue during the last 3 years. And in terms of technological sanctions, they were actually targeting only on the future production, like Arctic offshore and Bazhenov rock, unconventional oil, and so on. But what we saw during our modeling, that actually part of these technologies, which was listed as in the directives devoted to shale oil production, they can actually affect also brownfield conventional oil production like hydraulic fracturing, which is in Russia implemented just in order to sustain production on the operational fields. And moreover, the effect of these technological sanctions, it will aggravate with the time. So right now it's negligible. By 2025 we see already that 5% of Russian total oil output could be lost. By 2030 it is 10%. It's not a crash, it's not a collapse of the oil production, so it's still sustainable. But the speed is increasing, and the only way out from this dead end for the Russian companies is to develop their own domestic technologies. So they've tried to replace Western technologies with the Chinese, for example, or other Asian suppliers. To a certain extent, as long as it is not directly under sanctions, it works. So the biggest part of drilling equipment right now in Western Siberia is already Chinese. But when it comes to more sophisticated technologies, Chinese made it very clear that they don't want to take sanctions risk. So still, as you understand, with sanctions, there are lots of bypasses and gray zones, and you can produce like 10 daughter companies and then hide the way how the technology has actually arrived to Russia. But it means increased transaction costs and much longer time. So at the end of the day, it would result in higher production costs. So it's a temporary solution, but not for the perspective of 2025, 2030. And I would say in Russia, there are no more hopes that sanctions could be lifted anytime soon. So people are preparing to live under them for the whole foreseeable future. So therefore, this desire to develop import replacement is in place. The problem is that nobody knows how to do that. And I would say during the last 3 years, despite all the efforts, not a single hydraulic fracturing fleet was produced in the country. So despite everybody understands that it's urgent, it's necessary, but the industry itself, and it's not the oil industry, it's the equipment producers and new materials and software, so all the other stuff, it's not in place, there is no expertise. Companies used to call Halliburton and Schlumberger when they were going for any new development requiring new technologies. And so Russian domestic expertise is nearly destroyed. There are still some research centers, some very smart people, but they cannot replace the whole industry. And now they have the companies, the oil companies are trying to find a way how to establish this new industry.
Is there a brain drain from the oil technology and manufacturing to other parts of the world?
Yes, Houston, first of all.
Houston.
Yeah, there is. And there were several Russian startups which began in Russia and then moved to the US because the whole ecosystem for them here is much more favorable. So it's not surprising, but the companies are now they've spent first a couple of years on the sanctions trying to develop these technologies in-house. Rosneft, for example, everything inside without any cooperation. But I think now is the point when everybody begins to realize that you cannot replace the global oil service industry with your domestic capacities. So now they start to cooperate. We can see an example of such cooperation between, for example, Gazpromneft and Tatneft, with their attempt to develop cyber hydrofracking, so it's a software for fracking, or Gazpromneft going for Bajan polygon, where they invite all the companies to test their technologies for Bajana rock development, which is Russian shale oil.
Test the ground.
Yeah. So there are some attempts, but anyway, you understand it will take years, 7-10 years, who knows. So how fast will be this development? It's a big question mark, and it refers both to the enhanced oil recovery on the operational fields, unconventional oil production, Arctic or any other offshore, because in all these areas Russian dependency on imported equipment is like 95 to 98%. So that's a big question mark. As for the sanctions concerning Nord Stream and the whole gas export, because actually the wording allows to apply to any export pipeline from Russia, that's indeed regarded as a threat. And if you saw immediately when this bill was submitted to the Congress, Gazprom has speeded up Turkish Stream construction, because this is exactly a project where only international expertise can be applied. Russia doesn't know how to lay these deep water pipelines. So they speed it up without waiting for permission from Turkish side, just go before it is sanctioned. And yesterday or day before yesterday, they've announced that the first string is built already. So it's extraordinary speedy process is done. Now they are, and they began laying both strings in parallel. So not waiting before the sanctions are announced. With Nord Stream 2, I have suspicions that that could be also the case, going on without waiting for all the permissions in place, if there is a realistic threat of sanctions. So far, it is a very complicated negotiation, and as you've mentioned, it's a game inside European Union, Ukraine, US, Russia. So it seems to be a part of the whole negotiating process on Ukrainian transit and Turkish Stream as well. It is requiring some sort of a complex solution. Nord Stream 2 cannot be solved as a separate issue. And I think what Angela Merkel did with her statement about Nord Stream and Ukrainian transit is exactly invitation to begin this negotiation, because 2018 is actually approaching, and so far we have only statements from different sides and no real negotiating process. And nobody wants to meet the winter with the gas switched off, of course. So I think it will be the most important topic for the next year. I don't know what the outcome will be. So European gas demand is growing. Russian gas exports, as I've shown, are booming. And it's the first time that Gazprom is really approaching maximum transit capacity, both through Ukraine and through all its existing pipelines. So actually, if demand will further increase and if there will be bigger call on Russian gas, there will be already infrastructure constraint. So decision on Nord Stream or something with Ukrainian transit, like repair of the existing Ukrainian system and increased transit capacity, it's already becoming like needed. So what I've missed? Your question?
Well, my question was, it's not doing so badly if the main goals you mentioned, Turk Stream, NS2, Nord Stream 2, the East, and LNG, major strategic goals are met. The strategy, whether it's explicit semi-explicit, it's a draft, but it's a draft that is being implemented, or implicit, the strategy is being implemented. You're saying correctly, in my view, that the sanctions may, if they are consistently applied and enforced, because I'm old enough to remember the 1980s. I was a young budding journalist writing about international business. The sanctions on the gas pipeline to Europe that the Reagan administration was trying to implement were enforced spottily, and the amount of circumvention of those sanctions was tremendous, and there were special structures, shall we say, in the USSR and around the world that their job was to circumvent those sanctions, and the Toshiba pumps miraculously arrived to the Soviet Union to pump that gas. But I would like to go to Ambassador Morningstar and ask, do you think, Ambassador, that the sanctions regime as it is now is going, we're hearing it's not changing very much the strategic goals of the Russian oil and gas exports. Is it going to change the Russian international behavior vis-a-vis Ukraine and Syria, and that confrontation that is in its intensity very comparable in its rhetoric and in some critical issues such as deterioration of arms control already? Is it going to change Russian international behavior as it is now?
Well, with respect to energy sanctions, I would say that as the sanctions stand now, no, or not particularly. But to me, the greatest uncertainty isn't what the sanctions are now, but the risk of what the sanctions may be in the future. And that's all very hypothetical. So it's very difficult for investors, for example, to judge what that risk really is. If you were to say, well, gee, there's a 1 in 3 chance that there'll be future sanctions that could directly affect Nord Stream 2 or other projects, Turkish Stream, or even Rosneft activities in other countries, that, how do you weigh that, and how do companies make that kind of decision? So that, to me, is the great uncertainty, and I think that uncertainty is going to last for a period of time, and could have some effect. Question it would be as to how much, and I would go further and say, what you argued, that Russia is trying to have a more global impact, and there are projects in India and Venezuela and various other places. I suppose there's a risk, I think it would create havoc with those countries, particularly our friends, of ultimately there being sanctions on projects in third countries. Do you see that as an issue? I'd also ask one further question to get a little bit further into the competition situation within Russia, the Novatek-Gazprom competition, what Rosneft is trying to do in the gas area. Do you see this as moving forward and as helpful as far as ultimately Russian exports? I'm from Boston. I was surprised to see LNG coming into the terminal that's right next to Logan Airport from Novatek and the Yamal project. So anyway, I guess those were my points.
Yeah, with the projects in the third countries, in this latest edition of the sanctions, it was not mentioned.
Right, for now.
I think, and I think companies have actually made a lot of effort to avoid it being mentioned, but I agree, that's a threat. And basically, sanctions, they are so influential not only due to their direct impact, but also because they are creating a huge gray zone where counterparties prefer just not to step in because they do not know how it will work later on. So or they are requiring such a huge risk premium that it makes the whole project commercially unattractive. You've mentioned Venezuela, you've mentioned, I think there was Libya also, so there were several locations where all these investments from the very beginning, frankly, were not commercially driven, but much more driven by the geopolitical considerations from the Russian side. So therefore, I believe that these sort of investments will still be there, though it is destructive for the companies, but yeah, that's like their social obligation. But commercial, truly commercial projects, they, I think, will be threatened. And I mean, we don't know what will be the next step. The very fact that the name of Miller was put on the sanction list, for me, is a very bad sign, because first of all, it has demonstrated that European allies, as you've mentioned, were not consulted, or their opinion was ignored, because otherwise I cannot imagine his name appearing there. Which means that, so from the very beginning, from 2014, actually Gazprom was enjoying quite a special treatment, exactly because its role for European energy security. And now it is changing. And so maybe, Elizabeth, maybe you could comment on legal issues of his name appearing in this list. But my, understanding is that it is already like bad movement.
There's nothing sacred left. Ничего святого.
Yep.
I don't know that I'd say
There's a
Miller or
lot
Gazprom are sacred.
Well, for Russians, it's a sacred cow. Elizabeth.
I don't know. There's a lot. I think there's a lot that's sacred left, but which is why your comments. That's the real sort of credibility of your comments, is that because there's so much sacred left, that's why there's this risk of where it goes next. But just briefly on. So I'm not a lawyer. Obviously, this is not anyone's legal guidance, but the putting Alexei Miller on the list is, I think we should see this as parallel to having Sechin named, which is to say, and when he was designated, there was some language that was relatively unprecedented. Well, there's some precedent, but it confused a bunch of people in this context, because it says it's in his personal capacity. And so the business over which he presides, which is to say, so for Sechin Rosneft, then it doesn't, these prohibitions don't attach to all of his business dealings. But one thing we learned from the OPEC enforcement action against Exxon for, in the energy industry, a very small amount of money, but it's an enormous deal made out of it, is that one of the things you can't do, apparently, is put Sechin on a contract with then CEO Tillerson, no matter what that is, maybe an MOU or any one of a number of contracts attendant to a particular joint project or set of activities. And so what's happened here with Miller is the same sort of thing. So it does not, these measures don't attach to all of Gazprom. That would be enormous. Rather, it's just to him, and presumably it means that it would make it difficult to facilitate and enjoy the political theater that often goes along with having Miller, in particular, shake hands and sign a document with counterparts in Europe. So it's meant to be primarily symbolic, and it has a huge impact because of what you've just said. It also creates this real anxiety about whether the natural gas sector and exports are sacred or not. In 2014, the United States government said our intent is not to go after natural gas, and it's not to go after current production and supply, but rather frontier energy plays to be developed in the medium term and beyond. So when you name the head of Gazprom, what does that mean? So it's meant to be a shot across the bow, but not to collapse the business operations of Gazprom. And presumably, there are some companies that look at this and say, perhaps we must redo contracts that have Miller's name on them, because if we're not meant to sign new ones, perhaps we aren't meant to continue existing ones that keep them there. But that's sort of a legal matter which we can set aside for those companies. But the anxiety, that it was meant to instill some amount of anxiety as a shot across the bow.
Can I just add to that, because I think you're right, basically, on your analysis. But I also would suggest that there really is a need for clarification on that. coming from OPEC or from whoever, because even though there probably would not be an issue dealing with Gazprom without Miller being involved. Yeah, but are we so sure of that? And you know lawyers, and I've had.
I think they're pretty sure of that
well,
at present.
I know this, that I know how, and I'm not disagreeing with you,
right.
But the concern I would have with lawyers is that they are so cautious that I've had companies who've come in here and spoken with us who would not want to see this happen, concerned, asking, well, what does this really mean? And I could imagine their lawyers saying, well, we can't be totally sure. I don't think it'll create a problem, but I wouldn't say 100% certain. And I think it goes back to maybe to your point, Tatiana, as to sort of creating something of a mask of uncertainty. So I really would encourage our government to make clear what that situation is, even though I agree with you basically as to what the real case is.
And the question is, who in the government has appetite
Right.
to expanding these sanctions? Is it the president? I'm not so sure. Is it the new State Department? I think too early to tell. Is it the new National Security Council or National Security Advisor? I don't know. And that's the high level that demonstrates, that just little analysis demonstrates how uncertain these things are. I think at this point we have half an hour left, which is plenty of time. We have at least 2 or 3 non-resident senior fellows from the Atlantic Council here. We have a number of ambassadors. And I see some hands, so let's start with Dr. Rodriguez here, our non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council.
So, Agnia Rodriguez, Atlantic Council. My question is, we've heard that, Russian energy is doing just fine. And again, for now, right? Still going on the momentum. I wanted to get a little bit your thoughts on really the transformed energy markets and what that really means for Russia today, especially in the gas markets, when it really has to compete now in very competitive markets with US LNG, with, even if we look in Europe, where Gazprom has lost its monopolist markets in Central and Eastern Europe, with Southern Gas Corridor coming online, with the European Commission becoming more strict, let's say, with Gazprom playing by the rules. And then again, you've mentioned Asia, but in Asia we see a lot of competition as well. Just for China, we have Central Asian gas going to China, we have American LNG, of course Qatari, Australia, and many other players. So are you as optimistic in Russia's energy's ability to adapt and respond?
Now, can I just push it a little bit further? I was shocked to discover that the base load in certain parts of England are no longer natural gas or nuclear. The base load is renewables. So gas, and one of the companies is bailing out of major thermal stations because of the competition from the renewables. Yes, it's created by the government with feed-in tariffs and whatnot. But just to push that point that Agnia suggested, is Gazprom ready for competition for all this volume of renewable energy in Europe?
Very good question, thank you. So first of all, I just want to clarify, it's not my intention to say that Russian energy sector is in a perfect shape, an opposite. I would say that when we are talking about Russian energy strategy, which should be about Russia, it is in stagnation and in a very bad situation with no progress visible. The markets domestically are in terrible stagnation and with no hope for any real competition or any recovery. But the part which concerns global Russian presence and all these hydrocarbon revenues, here I would say adaptation was extremely successful. it's not, once again, a long-term strategy, because exactly as you mentioned, it doesn't take into account the change of the whole environment, of the global energy mix, the growth of competition. Though we are trying to convince the government that, look guys, the world is changing, and actually you were laughing at renewables, now they are real competitors, not only in the UK but in many other locations in the world.
Laughing at shale. I remember
Exactly.
Miller was just being derisive of shale, and I looked at it because I knew the condition of shale here is booming. It's like, what is it this guy's smoking? They neglected it and fell behind.
Now the same story with renewables and storage. Oh, come on, it wouldn't fly. There is not enough lithium in the world. So all these rhetorics, you know, very, very typical. And the whole growth of competition, both in the gas and in the oil market, both in Europe and in Asia, it came as a big surprise, though it was absolutely predictable. But still, the companies are struggling to adapt to that. And for the government, you know, very funny thing, but in the Russian energy security strategy, which was also prepared by the energy ministry, renewables and electricity storage are named as the biggest threat for the security, for the energy security of the Russian Federation. So the understandings begin to appear, but still the whole strategy is not designed to fit into this global energy system in transition. And all the adaptation, so all the strategy of keeping market niches is focused on adaptation, providing price discounts, reviewing contracts, providing some more favorable conditions, not changing the system itself. No, some small adjustments step by step when it becomes obvious that otherwise you will lose the client. Okay, then after a year of negotiations or 2 years, providing some discounts. So it is very reactive, not proactive strategy. And it looks like Gazprom at least will follow it in the future. So as last year has shown, if there is high gas demand in Asia and if oil prices are not very high, actually Gazprom can relax and just enjoy growing exports. So if there will be problems in Asia in terms of demand growth, and as we see oil prices going up, Gazprom's competitiveness is reducing, so probably next year Gazprom will have to make some additional efforts and really struggle more stronger to protect its positions in Europe. But so far everything is fine, so they do not need to make these efforts. So once again, not so much of a strategy, but much more of tactics.
Well, there's also an aspect, and this is sensitive. We're being broadcast here, so I'll say it nevertheless. There is a state-level raison d'etat, national interest policy. And there is also the smugness of the people who came from nothing, essentially, and are now dollar billionaires or multi-billionaires, and I won't mention any names. So for them personally, and they are in these positions 7, 10, 15 years, for them personally, it's just fine. There's no shareholder pressure with the exception of one shareholder.
Yeah.
There's one shareholder in this company.
Exactly.
And as long as the shareholder is happy, they're happy too. And that creates executive comfort, not to say smugness. That is one of the causes, not all of it, but one of the causes of this failure to catch up with market developments, with technological developments, with a vision for the country and the world. Ambassador, you were very patient here. Yes, please.
Let me just say that Ambassador Kozlerich here, we have with us today the charter members of former U.S. ambassadors to Azerbaijan.
Here we go.
There's Rich, Bob Sakuda, and me. I also see Marcy Rees, who's former ambassador to Bulgaria. I don't know if I'm...
Yes.
Oh, and Mary Warlick,
Yes.
former ambassador to Serbia, among other things.
So my question's not about Azerbaijan. But it really has to do with the future of Lukoil specifically and the private sector in the Russian energy arena. And secondly, what you've described looking out seems to imply a lot of stress being placed on the infrastructure for transportation, in particular to meet all of these new markets that you see. Vulnerability by financial sanctions. How do you see the infrastructure responding to the potential for greater exports to Asia and to Europe?
Thank you. Well, infrastructure is actually being expanded, and during the last decade, investments in infrastructure were overwhelming. They were higher than upstream investments, actually. So, not mentioning that it's a very good business for some companies, and very significant stakeholders which are promoting this development and pipeline construction. But it was also regarded as a very important part of the regional development, especially in the Russian Eastern Siberia and Far East. So at the moment, I wouldn't say that the state of infrastructure is bad. Many old pipelines were repaired. The newly built are built according to the new standards. So they seem to be okay. It's not like it was in 1990s when actually looking at the infrastructure was a terrible exercise. Now it seems to be more or less fine, but still many assets have to be replaced just as they are aging. And the first question. Lukoil. Oh my God. It's really frightening what's happening with the oil industry concentration, and the whole case of Bashneft was extremely disappointing for all the observers. And now there are lots of rumors, around Lukoil, around Tatneft. I hope that they are wrong, but of course there are no guarantees. Look, for the country which is positioning itself as a Russia fortress surrounded by the enemies, what is the logical way to proceed with the domestic industrial structure? Of course, concentration under the state control. So that looks, in mobilization economy, that is something logical.
This is, how many years is 1927? Commanding Heights? Yeah. The end of new economic policy, 1927. Lenin versus Stalin versus the Politburo.
Can I make one comment? Just apropos of what you're saying about concentration of the sector and enhanced government control, just on to respond to the question about financing for infrastructure. So given that there's already such strong monopolistic and control and concentrated government influence, it does mean that the sector is already pretty shielded from external pressures on access to new financing, because it's already so significantly driven by government financing. So in fact, I think that's one of the reasons why there was an effort to do sanctions designations in that sector to begin with in 2014, because in fact it's more bark than bite, which is what they wanted then. So lesser vulnerability now on the financing side.
I think Ambassador Warlick has a mic. Yep.
Good, thank you very much. I just wanted to follow up a little bit on the question that Ambassador Kozlerich had raised about infrastructure issues, because I was a little bit surprised by your comment about pipeline capacity constraints into Europe. I mean, it's been my understanding that the current pipelines that exist have been somewhat underutilized, and it's been quite clear from what has come out of Russia that a major push with regard to Nord Stream 2 has to do with providing an alternative, clearly, to the current gas transit through Ukraine. And they've also been quite clear from the Russian side about their desire to end transit through Ukraine by the end of the decade. So, and of course, Turkish Stream plays a role in that regard as well. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that. I mean, particularly, too, in the context of the comment that, Europe is increasingly moving to renewable, clean energy alternatives, and so it's sort of hard to see an environment where demand is really increasing significantly in Europe.
much. So it's one of the most surprising developments of the last year, that when suddenly Russian gas exports to Europe have jumped by nearly 40 BCM during just 1 year. So you are right, just a year before capacities were significantly underutilized. But with these record export volumes, actually, if you look at the utilization of Ukrainian transit, you would see that several months in February, even in April, they were at record levels, like in winter, because now Europeans are pumping up gas into the underground storages, which are nearly exhausted during this winter. And yes, indeed, with the average 160, 140 BCM Russian exports, there was the possibility to replace Ukrainian transit if both Turkish Stream and Nord Stream 2 are built. But with the higher European demand, which we are observing right now, I can hardly imagine how to avoid Ukrainian transit, even with all the new pipelines, if they are in place. Moreover, Ukrainian transit, if you look at the dynamics, it was actually the one which was covering peaks. So while Nord Stream was providing stable capacity, like a base load, Ukraine has much higher flexibility, and you understand demand is becoming more and more uneven, and with all these peaks. To my mind, the Ukrainian transit is absolutely necessary to sustain reliability of Russian supplies, even with all the new pipelines. But again, it's the subject for all these very complex negotiations. As for the European gas demand, another surprise. So nobody actually expected that it will increase so fast in such a short period of time. To a large extent, that was a result of unique coincidence of low oil prices. So gas was, and high coal prices. Yeah, so gas became much more competitive than coal, and the switching from coal-fired generation back to gas-fired generation, it was definitely taking place last year in Europe. Whether it will be sustainable this year, next year, question mark. And you see phasing out nuclear and all the recent announcements about phasing out coal, plus this absolutely unexpected decline of gas production in Groningen in Netherlands. All these three factors are actually suggesting that in the medium term we can expect higher European demand. Of course, if we are looking in the longer term perspective, like in 10-year time, renewables could replace part of that, but it is taking time. Meanwhile, gas seems to be very critical for European fuel mix.
Can I follow up on Ambassador Warlick's question and ask you a very direct question? I think the companies who are investing in Nord Stream 2 would agree with you. They claim that they're particularly because of diminishing gas resources in Europe. Norway will probably stay about the same between new and depleting assets. Other assets are depleting. That Ukraine transit is absolutely necessary. But I think the point that the ambassador was making is an important one, that it seemed like the whole raison d'etre for Nord Stream 2 and Turkish Stream was to once and for all avoid Ukrainian transit. So the question is, do you believe that an agreement sufficient to satisfy the parties could be reached with respect to Ukrainian transit that would be binding and enforceable, or is this, no pun intended, a pipe dream that will be virtually impossible to happen given the relations between the parties and given the desire to get rid of Ukrainian transit?
And a view of the current, is it litigation or arbitration in Stockholm?
Arbitration, yeah.
It's arbitration between Ukraine and Gazprom.
Yeah, it's not making the whole story easier.
No.
I would say, but look, indeed the initial intention was to completely get rid of Ukrainian transit, I believe, in 2010, 2012. So, but then after looking at the details of the contracts and the whole geography of supplies, it became absolutely obvious that Gazprom cannot completely refuse from Ukrainian supplies. Otherwise, some of its customers in Central and Eastern Europe, it's extremely difficult and extremely expensive to supply them. So now I think it was 2014 when Miller said, yeah, we are going to completely bypass Ukraine, and then in a couple of months there was an order from Putin to begin negotiations with Ukraine concerning transit. So okay, we will still keep some of the volumes, but so small that it doesn't give Ukraine any leverage and any significant revenues. So I think now that is the target. I don't think that in medium to long term Russia will be able to completely refuse from a relationship with Ukraine. Though, of course, there are very emotional reactions to the Stockholm arbitration and all these statements that we will break up the contract completely. And
but beats the
it is understandable if you take into account the whole geopolitical situation and all the tension. But I think at the end of the day, the penalties for non-supplying customers in Central and Eastern Europe are so high that basically still there will be, after all these emotional waves, there will be some attempt to find a solution, and still some transit volumes will be kept. So I don't see the way how to avoid it for Russia.
Interesting question, because the toxicity of that relationship is just unbelievable. And when you go to Kiev, you go to Moscow, you listen to what each party says about the other, and Ukrainian extremists saying, oh, we just need to walk away from Minsk, and they say, replace it with what? And do what? And provoke a war? Doesn't make sense for you because you're not a strong party. Very, very difficult. I think Dr. Schaefer was interested in asking a question. Brenda is a senior fellow here.
Hi, nice to see you. And very nice, the Atlantic Council has actually, as you said, a representative from Moscow here. It's so important to keep these ties open.
But not an official representative. Let's keep it
a citizen.
Absolutely.
We don't think so.
The next stage, or maybe the current stage of emphasis in climate aversion policy, is to look at methane emissions. And the biggest source of methane emissions in the oil and gas sector in Russia. How much is Russian oil and gas sector addressing methane emissions? And you mentioned this new generation of pipelines. Do they conform with more or less the Western standards of methane emissions? And how important does Russia recognize that this is important for keeping gas's competitive advantage in terms of its low climate impact?
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Very good question. But I'm afraid that most of people in Russia wouldn't even understand it, because methane emissions are not subject for discussion. Nobody cares, frankly. So the only company which really works and focuses on this issue is Gazprom, exactly for the reason you've mentioned, because it's about the whole competitiveness and acceptability of gas in Europe. So pushed by European colleagues, Gazprom is making several studies and making publications showing that we are nice and smart and our methane emissions are on global average, and the technologies in gas transportation are like normal and acceptable. But for the rest of the country, for the government, for the energy ministers, it's not a problem at all. It's not under discussion.
Okay. We have time for a couple of more questions. Let's collect 3 questions, because I would like to have some time for the panelists, for the speaker and the panelists to sum up. So I'll do 1, 2, and 3, and that's all the time we have. Yeah, gentleman with glasses there.
Philip Cornell, I'm another fellow here.
Oh, good.
My question was going back to the discussion about oil prices. I wanted to know, what do you see to be the evolving Russian incentives vis-a-vis the OPEC, non-OPEC production deal? What do you see to be sort of mismatches between their interests and the Saudi ones? And what do you see all that looking like next year, particularly given that it seems like the deal has achieved its official goal, given inventories, and what does that mean for American production?
Mm-hmm. Should I answer now?
Yep. Go to the other two questions, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Bob Eichhorn, also from the Atlantic Council. The gas demand's growing in China, and you mentioned the sort of the, quote, Russian pivot to Asia in terms of the region and the huge demand there. But the development of the pipeline with China has been very slow, it appears to me. Can you talk a little bit more about that and how Russia looks at the China market in the future and competition?
And yes. Yep. Oh. Okay. Well, we'll do 4 real quick. Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay. I almost fell off the list. Thank you. My name is Michael Clark. I represent the city of Kaiserslautern, Germany, which is the largest overseas stationing of U.S. Defense personnel. In the FY 2018 Armed Services Act, the NDAA, the Secretary of Defense was directed to establish a policy which, to the maximum extent possible, would represent that the American defense installations in Europe would be less dependent on natural gas as an energy source. The obvious reason being the lessons of the Putin experience in the Ukraine and other problems over the years of a political nature over there. Elimination of natural gas totally for these facilities is just not practical. I wanted to know, in view, especially the ambassador and our energy security lady there, where does this all fit in? We're talking about the expansion of energy, the Russian situation economically. Also, we've had the references here to 2014 and to the threats of cutting off the gas. We have ambassadors here from concerned nations. We have experts on our panel. How does this peculiar, if you will, but very essential thing to American defense policy factor in?
Okay, good. And
thank you.
Last question here in front, real quick. We have 5 minutes for everything.
Sure. Elliot Roseman with the United States Energy Association. I just got back from a trip to southeastern Europe, so Serbia, Montenegro, Albania, etc., Bosnia-Herzegovina. Do you see any interest in the Russian energy, I won't call it a strategy, but in their tactics maybe, with regard to that part of the world, or is there so much going on in all the other places that we've talked about? Russia did purchase the Serbian gas company, so is southeastern Europe have any interest in Russian energy strategy?
Thank you.
Okay, very good. So Tatiana, and then we'll end up with them.
So I'll answer very short, though I could speak about OPEC Plus deal for ages. It's extremely interesting and really important. It's becoming more and more fragile. And the attempt for opportunistic behavior from all the participants is increasing, including Russia, which was actually aiming at 1.5 years of cut, but no longer. But now it has to ally with the Saudis, which are most likely preparing for Aramco IPO and still keep prices high. Though Russian companies are actually just waiting for a signal to start drilling. They've postponed all their projects which were already completely invested for, and so now they are losing money, obviously. So of course the growth of price, the growth of revenue, so that's all great, but for the oil companies, they do not receive anything from that. It's the state which is grabbing the major part of the oil price increase. So for companies, it's becoming painful, but at the same time, we talked about the relationship between the state and the companies and the oligarchs, so they are just fulfilling what they are told to do. So though they are complaining, they are making signals, okay, come on guys, we have to go out from this deal already, but everybody understands that just terminating the deal would immediately lead to the oil price collapse. So it has to be done in a very smooth way with all the messages that we are here for decades and generations to cooperate, that we will keep looking at the markets and coordinating all our efforts and all this stuff. But I think there will be a very smooth transition until the end of this year to more, a sort of symbolic deal rather than real production cuts. Moreover, I am absolutely convinced that the whole deal was about Russia not cutting production, but just promising not to increase it. Yeah? Power of Siberia and gas exports to Asia. Actually, that was the case in just a year ago. Very slow construction, and everybody was thinking that Gazprom will commission it only in 2022, actually. But this summer, when Chinese authorities saw how demand is growing, and when they actually ordered to switch from coal to gas in district heating, they've directed to Gazprom and asked to speed up the process. And actually, the second half of 2017 and beginning of 2018, Gazprom is working very hard on construction of the pipeline. So it looks, at least when you follow their progress, that it will be ready by the end of 2019. So at the request of Chinese, they speeded up the process. It's a question mark whether the gas processing plant will be ready by that time, which should be on the Chinese border, and whether the upstream development at Chiyanda will be fast enough to provide sufficient volumes of gas. But anyway, the build-up of the pipeline capacity normally takes like 4 or 5 years, so they will start with probably 3 to 5 billion cubic meters per annum, and then year after year increase it up to 38 BCM. But I would say from the Chinese side, for the first time, we see a very intensive request to move ahead with that. So I'm afraid I cannot comment on gas security issues. I'm not actually aware of the details. But as for the southeastern Europe, I think the whole story of South Stream shows pretty well that Russia indeed has very big interest to expand in this region. I cannot say to which extent it is economically driven, to which extent it is just part of the geopolitical ambition, but definitely all these countries are of big interest for Russia.
I could maybe talk for a minute about the security, energy security aspects. I think that was a very good question. We also have, I've seen the audience, Arnaud Dupuis, if I'm pronouncing your last name right, who's very interested in this area as well. There may be others. I think that new energy technologies are actually a significant priority for our military. And it's very important that, for example, renewable technologies be used as an electricity source for forward units, whether in Europe or in other places as well, and have to be explored. I think the issue that you raise relates to the whole issue of European energy security, and that NATO talks about it, needs to emphasize it more, but alternatives, energy alternatives, whether it be new technologies, interconnectors throughout Europe, other sources of gas, all of which I think are very important, and I think this is in fact a real issue.
Okay, we are over time. I would suggest that Elizabeth Rosenberg says her short concluding remarks, if any.
Since we are over time, I will say one last final thing on energy security, hopefully to summarize and wrap us all up here. I certainly agree that it's appropriate to be concerned about supply disruptions on many levels, not just in this European one. Surely there's an array of other supply disruption concerns when it comes to thinking about the Russian energy sector broadly for various reasons. But I will end by saying it doesn't really help when we call out, or in the NDAA, one particular concern is called out and it's not a systemic approach or an actual strategy. So thinking about US military installations, supply security is fine and good, but unless we're thinking very broadly about the array of storage, interconnectors, fuel sources for Europe, then it's not worth the paper it's published on, or the electrons. Anyway, and furthermore, that goes much more broadly to Russia, which was the point that Tatiana started out by saying, where in fact it's rather a disparate strategy, if you even want to put that label on it. So systemic is presumably what is most appropriate in our analysis and in thinking what needs to come forward in order to address an array of concerns.
Great. And last word from our speaker.
Oh my God. Okay. So, I was just thinking about one phrase which Talleyrand said long ago about Russia, that it's never as strong as it seems and never as weak as it seems. So my suggestion is not to exaggerate the threats and not to underestimate the potential influence. And therefore, I'm really very grateful for Atlantic Council for organizing this event, because I'm absolutely convinced that only keeping the dialogue and trying to explain what the hell is going on, we can actually find the way out, because basically, well, the whole situation doesn't move in a good direction, and we should keep talking. So that's it. Thank you.
Maybe it's, in that case, I'll keep my observations for an op-ed I'm thinking about writing based on our discussion here. But I want to thank the audience. You were great. I want to thank the panelists and the speaker. Thank you very much, and hope to welcoming you again to the Atlantic Council.